And for them to pay taxes to the central government. As long as order was kept, people produced, and taxes were paid, then the Ottoman state was happy to leave the finer detail of administration to bishops and to archimandrates. And the other contribution that the people in the Balkans made was to the Ottoman military and civil service. And this was by an annual levy of young Christian boys who would be taken by recruitment gangs. They would be converted to Islam. You couldn't enslave freeborn Muslims, but you could enslave Christians. But this was, of course, a slavery of power. So these young Christian boys would be taken back to Istanbul. Those who were fit would be trained for military service, and that would be one career path towards advancement. The others, if you were smart and not physically fit, then you'd be trained for the civil service. And here again, a slave could become a minister, or indeed a grand vizier, prime minister. This servile route to power was one of the distinctive features that bound the Balkans to the Ottoman Empire.
Right. And tell me, I mean, what was their relationship with the Arabs? I mean, for all these centuries, before the First World War, in the 18th and 19th century, were the Arabs in revolt against? Did they see the Turks as oppressors? What was the relationship?
We have to remember that the Ottomans come to the Arab world in the 16th century. Under Sultan Selim, they conquer first Greater Syria in 1516, and then they topple the Mamluk Sultanate of Cairo in 1517. And at that point, the difference between the Mamluk dynasty and the Ottoman dynasty was a fine point as far as most people in the Arab provinces were concerned. The Mamluk dynasty was Turkish-speaking as well. These were Sunni Muslims ruling over Sunni Muslim people. It was just, if you like, the latest iteration of an Islamic empire. And for most of the Islamic centuries, the Arab people went along with that. They were divided into provinces. Their provincial capitals would have governors dispatched from Istanbul. And you would say that for most of the Ottoman centuries, that system worked fine. In the 19th century, the Arab world was also caught up with the idea of national identity. And we see the beginnings at the very end of the 19th century of Arab Ottomans beginning to distinguish themselves from Turkish Ottomans and trying to negotiate more respect for the Arab culture and political rights and whatnot. But I would say it was, if you like, a modern nationalist projection on the past of modern Arabs blaming their subordinate place in the world on having been held back by the Ottomans. And I think the Ottomans, coming out of the First World War, look back on the Arabs as the subject peoples who betrayed them, that the Arab revolt of the First World War was a knife in the back of the Ottoman Empire. But those are 20th century realities.
We come now to the First World War. I mean, you know, the situation just before the First World War was that the Ottomans were collapsing. I mean, basically. The sick man of Europe, is what they were called. Am I right?
The Russians coined that expression.
The Russians.
Tsar Nicholas.
And all the big powers around the Ottoman Empire, the Western powers and Russia and Iran and all the rest, they all were trying to make a grab for parts of the Ottoman. How do you see that? I mean, give us some insight into that collapse. Why did it happen? And why didn't the Ottomans stand firmer against particularly the British when the British moved into the Middle East?
It's such a good question, Ahmed. And you know, I spent a lot of my professional career arguing against the notion of Ottoman decline or the sick man of Europe. Yet when you come to the second decade of the 20th century, the Ottomans did look to be in a particularly weak position. They'd had a revolution in 1908, which restored the constitution to the Ottoman Empire and spelled the end of the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdulhamid II. In the aftermath of that revolution, there was a sudden furious land grab of Ottoman Balkan territories by stronger neighbors like the Austrian Empire. And then no sooner had the Austrians taken their bit than the Ottomans found themselves at war with Italy, 1911, The Italians were keen to seize a bit of Mediterranean territory in Libya for their imperial aspirations, small as they were. And immediately after that, the Ottomans had to stop fighting Italy because the successor states in the Balkans had clubbed together to make war on the Ottoman Empire for the last European territories they held, which ran from Albania through Macedonia to Thrace, a narrow band of Balkan territory, but against Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, Greece. The Ottomans found that they couldn't defeat even their former provincial territories. These small successor states were able to conquer the Ottomans, take the last of their territory in the First Balkan War. And at that point, it wasn't just the Europeans who were saying, this country is on its way out. Many in Ottoman Turkey itself believed that their empire had reached a terminal phase of decline and would not be able to pull out before the final crash.
And what did the Young Turks, who we heard a lot about, what did the Young Turks achieve? I mean, was this an attempt to salvage the empire, or was this an attempt to create a modern Turkey?
Well, the Young Turks are fascinating. They are, in a sense, the first of the military coups in the Middle East. And like so many of the other military coups, they were able to plan the overthrow of a government without having the confidence to rule in their own right. And so from 1908 to 1913, for 5 years after the Young Turk Revolution, the Young Turks basically stand back as a sort of guardianship council. In 1913, at the height of all of the drama in the Balkan War, the Young Turks actually decide that they will take power. And they organize a sort of coup in the Sublime Porte. They force the Grand Vizier to step down. And from that point on, the Young Turks will rule the Ottoman Empire. They do so sharing the duties of state between three key players. You have Talat Pasha, who will be Interior Minister and then Grand Vizier. You have Enver Pasha, Minister of War. And you have Jamal Pasha, who's Minister of Marine. And these three men are going to, in their separate ways, take their patriotic aspirations, apply it to the Ottoman Empire in a way which draws them into the First World War, and ultimately will lead to the disaster that will lead to the breakup. It was, if you like, with the best of intentions, the undoing of the Ottoman Empire.
Of course, what is so fascinating is the whole Arab revolt and the relationship with the Hashemites, who led the Arab revolt, aided by who we know very well, Lawrence of Arabia,
good Oxford man,
and other such characters. But this whole, I mean, the Hashemites are for a time successful, and then you get the arrival of the Saudis, who are. The British have pledged loyalty to the Hashemites, that there will be an Arab kingdom. We will create an Arab kingdom out of Syria and Iraq. And at the same time, the British are quietly canoodling with King Saud Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, who eventually comes into the Hijaz, western of Arabia, and throws out the Hashemites. And of course, this created a terrible reputation for the British as double dealing, I mean, with everyone, as it were.
In writing my book, I had to re-examine Britain's many relations across the Arab world against the background of Arab colleagues who have long told me about the double talk and the betrayals.
Yeah.
So a large part of the book does deal with the wartime partition diplomacy and the promises that Britain is making to all of its different allies. And it's not that I have any bias in favor of Britain, but I take a slightly more understanding line. That Britain, through the course of the war, I mean, basically it enters World War I with absolutely zero territorial ambitions in the Ottoman Empire. The first partition agreement is struck just before the Gallipoli campaign between Britain, France, and Russia. It's Russia that starts everything by saying, gentlemen, we're going to take the Ottoman capital shortly, and we want to add it to the Russian Empire, along with the European coasts of the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara, and the Dardanelles, so we have access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The British and the French say, these are big demands, the richest prize of the whole war, but we'll give you that. France says, we'll say yes on condition that we get Syria and Cilicia. I couldn't tell you what the boundaries of those two territories are because those were words that the Romans used for geography. They're not modern words.
Yeah.
And the British at that point say, we'll concede to French demands and Russian demands on condition that we can claim equal strategic territory as and when we decide what we want. But they start the war in 1915 with no clear idea of any territorial demands. Okay? They then do a very British thing. They convene a commission of inquiry to work out exactly what it is that they do want in the Ottoman Empire. It's called the de Bunsen Committee. And in the course of the war, it will be Mesopotamia that becomes their focus of interest. But it starts a whole process where the British are engaged in two things. They're desperate to win the war. And I think you have to remember, when we talk about British betrayals and double talk, it's against the background of a murderous conflict that is draining the lifeblood out of each of the combatant nations, not just Britain, but the Germans, the Austrians, the French, the Russians. They're all bleeding on an industrial scale. And so anyone in any position of power who can make any deal that might make any material difference to winning that war is doing their patriotic duty. So understand it in that context. Two, in that de Bunsen Committee report, Britain acknowledges that while it might be allied at the moment with Russia and France, they're very likely to be rivals in the future. And so Britain is very concerned in its wartime partition diplomacy to strike a balance of power, not with the region, but between empires, because they imagine the imperial age that entered World War I would be the same after World War I. They wanted to preserve a balance of power between empires. And if you take those two premises and a third, none of the deals that we talk about with the Hashemites, with Sykes-Picot, with Balfour Declaration, would ever have been made in peacetime. I mean, they're all lunatic agreements in their own rights. If you take them as ink on paper, they're lunatic agreements. So no one would have done them in their right minds in peacetime. Then you begin to understand why Britain is promising territory left, right, and center to as many different candidates.
Israel included.
Not Israel at that point, but the Zionist movement, Balfour Declaration. It's all about trying to secure alliances, to try and make a meaningful advantage on the war, and to try and keep France or Russia actively engaged in the war. Against all that, I think we can understand where the Hashemites and British came to.
And how does Kemal Atatürk become such a popular hero?
Well, let's call him Mustafa Kemal.
Yeah.
That was his name when he entered the First World War.
Right.
And Mustafa Kemal was, like Enver and Talat and Jamal, a committed Young Turk. And then the question is, why was he left out of the loop in the inner circle, those who really ran the Ottoman Empire, these three pashas that we mentioned? He had a tremendous success commanding Ottoman forces in Gallipoli.
Right.
He came out of the Gallipoli campaign celebrated as the most influential Ottoman commander to deliver victory against the greatest armies of the world. The Ottomans defeated the British and the French in Gallipoli. And that was very much something that was to his credit. And he was to go on to serve a very distinguished career through the rest of the First World War. He was involved in Syria in the defense against the British. He was part of the Yildirim fusion of German and Ottoman forces, so a very distinguished career. He was able, at the end of the war, he was sent on a mission after the signing of the armistice to demobilize Ottoman soldiers returning from Arab provinces and from the Caucasus regions, to disarm them in line with the armistice terms and to restore calm to Anatolia. But as he sets off to Samsun to demobilize, he gets word of the arrival of Greek forces in the Izmir region. And this motivates his patriotism to disregard his orders. Instead of demobilizing, he begins to mobilize. So here we have the successful general, charismatic leader, and now I'm going to shift gears and say, actually, when you read my book, he gets a bit of attention.
Yeah.
But I'm going to move,
overwhelmingly.
Not overwhelmingly, because to me what was even more astonishing than the success of Mustafa Kemal is the willingness of the average Mehmetçik. This is the affectionate name by which the Anatolian Turkish soldier was known, the little Mehmeds, what in God's name motivated men who had since 1911, 1912 been caught up in a relentless cycle of terrible wars? They suffered such hardship, such high levels of casualties. You would have thought that this least well-provided army, with the least material, the least resources, would have collapsed after defeat in the First World War. And yet, they rally for one more struggle. And this becomes a Turkish war of independence against Greece, France, the Armenians, even against the British, small presence as they were at that point.
I was reminded,
but the Mehmetçik is the one that we should be celebrating.
I was reminded of the Russians. I mean, you know, when the Russian army basically deserted the battlefield and gave the Bolsheviks a whole opportunity which was not there before. And it was very surprising why it didn't happen with the Turks as well.
It's astonishing.
I mean, if you read the figures of these battles and the losses, I mean, you would think that the whole of Turkey had just been wiped out.
Absolutely.
It's extraordinary figures.
But they managed to rally one more time and to prosecute their ultimate successful war. Of all of the defeated countries in the First World War, it was only Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, that was able to go back to the victorious powers and renegotiate the treaty. And this becomes the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, recognizing Turkey in its modern frontiers, more or less.
So let's come to the modern era. I mean, obviously, your book doesn't tackle that, but obviously all this history begs the question as to where are we today in the Middle East, and why didn't the Arab Spring take off? Now, I just want to remind everyone that if you remember, after the Arab Spring, the hero of the hour was actually Turkey and Erdogan. Turkey was the model. Here was a country that was becoming an Islamic state. It was modern. It was moderate. They educated their women and gave jobs for women. The Turks were seeming, and this was what the Arabs wanted to copy, wanted to emulate. They wanted a modern Islamic state with Islamic values. And Turkey was the hero for a short time, at least. And then, of course, dictatorship returns to the Middle East. Dictatorship in Egypt, in Syria, Syria dissolves into civil war in Iraq, and that Turkish model of moderation, if you like, or a moderate kind of Islam, disappears too. So what happens? I mean,
Turkey under the AKP had been a real role model for any country that had a strong Islamic political movement, but was hoping to bridge Islam and democracy by sticking true to your indigenous values and culture. AKP was a party in a multi-party political scene that had won elections, always on the understanding that should they lose the election, they would stand down and someone else would take their place. This broke what many had assumed to be the limits of Islamic political parties, that once in office they would not cede power to non-Islamist parties as a matter of religious duty. AKP seemed to hold out the prospect that you could be Islamic and democratic and be in a diverse political spectrum that involved secular and religious parties. And I think for a lot of the people in 2011 in the Arab world, that was the image they had. And the politics had worked really well in Turkey because the economy was booming in Turkey. So you'd like to have the kind of growth figures that Turkey under AKP was enjoying, in excess of 10%. Secondly, AKP had succeeded in curbing the power of the military over politics in Turkey. And this was the kind of achievement that would elude every Arab state in the Arab Spring. None of them were able to come out of the shadow of the power of the military, except Tunisia, where the military had never been involved in politics. And so people looked to AKP as a role model. More than anyone, though, it was those Islamist parties that were ideologically closest aligned to the AKP's own politics. And here I'm thinking of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the different franchises associated to the Muslim Brotherhood spread across North Africa and the Levant. And for them, the AKP was the natural partner. And the Arab Spring seemed to be the moment that allowed Muslim Brotherhood type parties to come to the forefront of politics in each of the revolutionary situations. But as we know, revolution across the Arab world was followed by counter-revolution. This wave of Muslim Brotherhood enthusiasm crashed, and in counter-revolution was swept away. And so the AKP's attraction and its influence as a role model diminished as a result. And I think what we spoke about earlier, a 20th century projection of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire having held the Arabs back, and a kind of antagonism between Arabs and Turks was to take its place. Today, you'll find very little warmth shown, let us say, between Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates or Egypt and Turkey. It proved to be a short moment of fraternity.
How did the Brotherhood curb the role of the military in Turkey? I mean, you know, it's an example that also we look at very closely. I mean, how did they do it?
Well, again, AKP, not the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood's never had the power to curb the military, say, in Egypt.
But wasn't the AKP a Brotherhood party or a Brotherhood allied party?
You know, I think it was a party whose vision of Islam and politics was close enough to that of the Muslim Brotherhood, but there are no institutional ties between Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood.
No, I mean,
So, I mean, I think AKP emerges from its own genealogy in Turkey, but you can see where their worldviews were close enough that they could see each other as fraternal movements. But in essence, it's a really important question. I could say that the AKP broke the power of the military through conspiracy theories. They put many leading generals in Turkey on trial for a conspiracy against the government, again Ikram. But that begs the question, what gave them the power to arrest and put on trial top-ranking generals? And I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know how it was.
And how did the judiciary go along with that? Because the judiciary must have been in league with the generals.
Again, this is a degree of infiltration of two institutions, the police, the police, the military, and the judiciary, that AKP was able to achieve in partnership with the Gülen movement, with which now AKP is at loggerheads. Clear hostility there. But you could say that in the first decade of AKP rule, there had been a strong infiltration of all three of those institutions by AKP and Gülenist cadres, which was to allow them to shift the balance of power so that they could actually take on the military through rule of law institutions and win.
Well, let me just ask you one question that has always bothered me. Why are the Turks so fanatically, now when the Ottomans were so much in favor of their minorities and gave them, you know, equal rights almost, why do we have the Turks now massacring the Armenians during the First World War, massacring the Kurds? Why are the Turks so intolerant of any kind of minority? You know, is this a macho sort of culture? Is this something they've inherited? Where does it come from?
All right. Well, I mean, I would dispel any myth of macho culture.
Yeah.
And I'd like to separate out the genocide of Armenians in World War I from the tensions that have emerged between Kurds and Turks in the end of the 20th century and have reemerged now. So let's take those separately. I mean, the Armenians occupy center stage in my book as the greatest civilian suffering of the war. And I try to contextualize why a genocide happened. And it comes very much in terms of an Ottoman struggle against minority communities who no longer accepted that Ottoman social contract of pay your taxes, we'll leave you to run your own show.
Right.
But had begun to aspire to self-rule that led to separatism, that had fragmented Ottoman rule in the Balkans. The Armenians were different because they lived in the Ottoman Turkish heartland of Anatolia. The project for the Armenians before World War I was an autonomous self-rule area in 6 provinces in the easternmost part of Turkey. In those 6 provinces, you had the majority of Armenians, but in no one province were the Armenians a majority, 20 to 30%. So it was a project that would put Sunni Muslims, mostly Kurds and Turks, under the government of Armenians in what was for the Turks absolute heartland. It was not negotiable territory. This is Anatolia. This is Turkish heartland. And this was backed by Russian support. With the outbreak of the war, with Russia identified as enemy number one, the conflicted position the Armenians found themselves in, of Russians offering support to the Armenians, calling them to cross sides, to abandon the Ottoman army, to join the Russian army, made them into a perceived fifth column, which sets the context for genocide. I stress in saying this that the fifth column argument is made by many who deny genocide, and that is not my aim. I stress that a genocide takes place. It was something that was recorded by Ottomans already at the end of the war. We shouldn't be talking about it now. But it's my job as a historian to try and explain why a genocide took place then and there. And it's quite different from the tensions with the Kurds of the 20th century, except in one essential point, which is, again, this notion that when cultural identity begins to lead to separatist movements through nationalism, then it becomes an existential threat to the integrity of the state. And the Kurds are seen today as such a community, with their separate language, their separate culture, their separate identity, that if given their cultural autonomy, it will encourage a nationalism that will lead to secession, and again, in territory in Anatolia that the Turks deem indivisible. So they are an existential threat, and the Turks fight them accordingly.
So you're saying that this is not some ingrained sort of Turkish model of manipulating minorities and dealing with them. This is a result of history and the way these groups have evolved, really.
Absolutely so. And we know that there is no force stronger than nationalism to make people behave in violent and irrational ways.
Right.
Maybe religion can do the same. But I mean, in modern times, nationalism is the force that has us abandon our humanity for abstract issues.
Finally, what influence do the Ottomans have on modern-day Turkey and the rulers of Turkey? I mean, people keep saying that Erdogan is another, sultan, and he acts like an Ottoman king and all. I mean, does that bear any resemblance to what Turks actually think? Western media is full of this. I mean, and I wondered how the Turks would see it.
It's a complex thing, because there's no doubt that Erdogan plays on the kind of symbolic value of the Ottoman Empire as part of his propaganda. Yeah. He's created a presidential guard that wear historic uniforms. It looks bizarre, but he likes it. He has built himself an enormous presidential palace, and he seems very happy to have it referred to as the Sultan's Palace. Yeah. And he doesn't go to great lengths to dispel people jokingly referring to him as a sultan. Yeah. So to him, the idea that you could once again be a power led by Turks that could dominate world affairs would be to the greater glory of an AKP-led Turkey. Right. But there are many other Turks still very committed to the secular nationalist values of Ataturk. Yeah. They tend to live in the big cities. You'll find them in Ankara, you'll find them in Istanbul, you'll find them in Izmir, who reject categorically any symbolism of Ottomanism. So the question is, what do I think would have happened had the Ottomans succeeded in their 1683 siege of Vienna? I mean, I think that you would still find doner kebabs on the streets of Vienna. I think by the time you came to the siege of Vienna, the reason for Ottoman defeat had far more to do with the limits of logistics in that early modern military age. It demonstrated how far the Sultan could mobilize troops and the required materiel to conduct a campaign. And I think Vienna is about as far as they could go without more modern means of transport. And also, I think they'd reached the limits of what they might be able to hold were they to conquer. No sooner did they retreat from Vienna than they were engaged in 15 years of war with both Russia and Austria. which forced the Ottomans by the end of the century to sign the first treaty in which they actually had to surrender Muslim land in the Crimean Khanate in the north of the Black Sea. So the Ottomans had, if you like, reached the heights of what they could hold on to, and they would spend the 18th century in conflict with strong neighbors who were developing new military technologies that were proving superior to those of the Ottomans, and would begin to push the Ottomans back in both Caucasus and Balkan territories. So it would have been dramatic had they taken Vienna, but I don't think it would have been enduring.
You mentioned that Erdogan is trying to recreate the glory of the Ottoman era, but in the question of the Armenian genocide, they claim, successive Turkish present-day governments claim that they are the Republic of Turkey and quite distinct from the Ottoman Empire, during whose reign the so-called genocide occurred. So is it a question of these people sort of taking pick and choose whenever it suits them? They go back to their glory days, and sometimes when it doesn't suit them, they just distance themselves from that era?
It's a very good question, and I don't know that I have a good answer for you. I've never understood why the current government of Turkey did not distance itself from the Armenian genocide in the same way that, for instance, the German Democratic Republic of East Germany distinguished themselves from the Nazis in the Holocaust. They acknowledged the Holocaust, they were critical of it, but they said, that was the old Nazis. We are now, the socialist German Democratic Republic. That's not part of our history or legacy. We struggle against it. The modern Turkish Republic could do the same. A very quick anecdote. I wondered in writing about the Armenian genocide whether I was disinviting myself from future visits to Turkey. As it turns out, that wasn't the case. And I was invited to a think tank in Ankara to speak precisely on the Armenian genocide. This surprised me. I had a talk, it was a small workshop of 30 people. It was hosted by the Chamber of Commerce of Turkey. There's a central, each city has its own Chamber of Commerce. This is the central board. They had this think tank. And at the end, I was like, this was a very interesting day for me, but what was this all about? And they said, we're a Chamber of Commerce. The most impoverished part of Turkey is the northeast. There are Armenian cities there that are very attractive to Armenian tourists from around the world. We believe that if we could get the Armenian genocide behind us, we could attract people in a way that would revitalize that part of the country. It also would be a great way for us to encourage Black Sea trade by opening more links with Armenia itself, the Armenian Republic. If we can get the history behind us, then we can see where it would bring benefit to the Turkish Republic. And the way you've written the history is respectful of the Ottoman Empire's war effort, but talks about a genocide. So we thought maybe you could help us to see a way you could put a historical narrative forward that would allow us to go beyond the problem of history and do business. And I think that that might be the way forward, is when they can devise an interest that will allow them to acknowledge what happened historically and move beyond it, not as a neo-Ottoman state, but as a Turkish Republic.
Talking about modern-day Turkey, after curbing the political strength or ambitions or interference of Turkish army and resulting into socio-economical gains by Turkey, do you think there's any downward trend towards the strength of the Turkish military after the curbing of their political powers? I want to relate it with the other countries where the army is either king or kingmakers, and this argument that if you try to control and curb the armies or the military strength, this will result in the weakness of the defense of the country. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that we saw before 2013 a successful effort to curb the army of Turkey's political power. and to reinforce the loyalty of the military to the government. But as I said before, there had been an infiltration of the military, of the judiciary, of the police, not just by AKP supporters, but by Gülen supporters. And when we came to the attempted coup in the summer of 2016, there has been a purge of the military and of all ranks of the bureaucracy, civil service, the administration, the courts, the police, universities, schools, which has made the government in Turkey very vulnerable, and not just the military in Turkey very vulnerable. That was sustainable as long as the Turkish economy continued to be strong. But we've seen in the past 18 months how bad policies by the government have taken away the confidence in the Turkish lira. So the economy itself is shrinking, and there's been a massive revaluation of lira, much to the disadvantage of the Turkish import-export markets and economy. So I think we might have seen a government that's overplayed its hand, that has weakened too many institutions, including the military, that's weakened its economy, that's weakened the cohesion of the state. And then the question is, what will be the force that will keep Erdogan in power now that he has his constitutional mandate to do so against so many enemies? I can't say that I can predict another coup, and I can't tell you that the military is completely out of politics. They still are vowed to uphold the guiding principles of the Turkish state, which were put in place by Ataturk. And in a recent visit to Turkey, going to Ataturk's grave, to watch military men come in great numbers to pay their respects to Ataturk tells you that this tradition is not gone, even under AKP. And so I think that the Turkish example of what one might hope to do in terms of curbing the military might prove limited. I would be anxious to observe what the military does in coming years and to see whether it doesn't play a role in redressing the imbalance in Turkey right now and the power vacuum that's emerging.
The repression, remember, has been absolutely staggering. I mean, there's 60,000 prisoners in Turkish jails from the professional classes, lawyers, educators, journalists, judges. The entire middle class has been shattered by what is going on. And of course, the human rights abuses and the condemnation of Turkey by all sorts of powers. And I mean, there are people going on trial. I read a report the other day that 200 people were on trial in a single room with a single judge. Yeah. And these people were going to be given sentences collectively. Yeah. All of them were guilty of one charge, and that there was no investigation. Their lawyers weren't allowed to make statements. It's quite a horrendous situation.